The communities in the Sierra Madre range of Durango tell stories of small beings that would come down from the highlands to steal clothing and food, as well as stalk the villagers from afar. It was said they had their own homes in the overhangs of the Sierras. In the 1990s and early 2000s, archaeological expeditions would discover something incredible. Within one of these overhangs, the perfectly preserved remains of wall and daub structures, many still containing artifacts, as it appears that the ruins were untouched by looters. This site was called Cueva del Maguey. Due to the small size of the buildings, many believed these were the houses of a pygmy-like people that may be related to those same beings that existed in folklore. However, the truth behind the people who built these structures that survived to the present is far more fascinating, and due to the state of preservation, can tell much about how they lived and their beliefs, and may even show a relation to historic tribes that inhabited the region. Within Cueva del Maguey are 18 structures, the two best preserved, built in the two different styles seen in the cave. The first structure we will look at, nicknamed CMAG-1, was built with an indigenous wall and daub technique, a two-story building. The outline was set with a stone base of 4 by 3 meters, or 12 by 9 feet. Next, they would carefully select wood, specifically young Lumholtz's pine, that were straight and would be used to support beams. This process was very labor intensive, having to carry them up the cliffside and then using stone tools to shape them. With these set into place, mats of cane would be tied around the beams with cordage made from soyate palm and would set the framework of the structure. Next, the most important part, a plaster made from mud and organic materials that will be placed onto the framework. Based on its preservation, the fingerprints of the people who made it are still there, and due to the different sizes of the prints, suggest this part was a communal effort with those belonging to a child found. Now for the inside. 2 large wooden beams would be placed in the center as columns, and then another large beam would serve to support smaller logs that would go across the ceiling and would jut out like rafters. Wood planks were tied with soyate palm cordage, and after it was all placed, it was covered in mud to keep everything in place, and this would serve as the roof for the first story and floor for the second story of the building. On the floor level of the building, in one of the corners, would be a 1.5 by 2 meter raised 10 centimeter platform of earth that was believed to be used as a sleeping area. There was also a hearth in the center placed closer to the entrance. It was assumed this may have served as the heart of the home, and similar to the beliefs of the historic indigenous peoples of the area, was seen as the abode of the fire god. It was put to much use in CMAG-1 as its walls were black with soot. Like many other areas to the north in Oasis America, the doorway was very small, and one would have had to bend down to enter the structure. There was also a smooth stone wedged on the floor of this doorway, perhaps some sort of denotation between the outside and inside. What's important to note is there seems to be a standardization of dimensions and techniques in the wall and daub buildings of the cave, being very similar to one another, showing that there was some planning when it came to utilizing the space of the cave. The author of the paper, José Luis Punzo, speculated that while serving a utilitarian purpose, the homes of Cueva del Maguey may also be a representation of their beliefs and reflecting their cosmology and how they applied how they saw their world and the characteristics and uniformity of the homes. The next style seen in the cave involved stonework. This was a lot less labor-intensive than the previously mentioned technique, as the masonry of the cave utilized materials found within it, which would be covered with the same plaster of mud and organic materials, with small pebbles added for support. These structures differed greatly, as they didn't have that elevated platform. There are also smaller buildings that may have served different purposes other than dwellings, maybe granaries, or even pens where parrots were stored, and will be mentioned in detail later. Within the ruins of the structures, many sorts of artifacts have been found. Ceramics, parrot feathers, textiles, some which would have been hung on walls for heating and decoration, and decorated with feathers. A small table used for ritual purposes, animal bones, and food remains, including domesticated crops such as corn cobs. This suggests that the peoples who inhabited the region practiced agriculture and also hunted, with deer bones showing evidence of cut marks. All this organic material was also tested, and the cave showed an occupation from the mid-1000s to mid-1400s AD, with CMAG-1 showing that it was occupied into the 1700s. As aforementioned, it is possible these people also raised parrots and macaws, as some of their feathers have been found within what were thought to be granaries. Accounts write about how the people of the Sierra would raise these birds for the sole purpose of plucking them for feathers, which they would adorn themselves with. One of the most gruesome discoveries, however, were 4 dozen human bones, 80% of which showed evidence of being defleshed, cut, and boiled, a stark contrast to the mummy burials that were interred within the cave. The bones show clear proof that there was some sort of cannibalism going on with the inhabitants of the cave. The dates, the similarities in material culture, especially the evidence of cannibalism, and the accounts of Spanish explorers detailing the peoples who lived in the region Cueva del Maguey is in, led to the conclusion that this site was built and inhabited by the Xiximes, an indigenous people from the highlands of Durango that were infamous for their prowess as warriors and going on raids to collect prisoners of war who they would sacrifice, cook, and consume. evidence of this being found inside the cave. In many Spanish accounts, the Xiximes participated in warfare and raids for half of the year. They had to do this to ensure next year's harvest was bountiful. They would drag those they killed back and then cook them in a large ritual to share in a meal with the entire group and consume the souls of the fallen. The bones would be kept and would be used to help in the planting of corn and help the cycle continue. It is said this is why they stored them and the reason they were found in such high numbers in Cueva del Maguey. There's also the fact that complete arrows have been found alongside the pits of sapote fruit. The symbolism of these two items were noted by Jesuit missionaries at the end of the 16th century in the highland people of Durango, and how in these cliffside dwellings, the natives would place a sapote tree on whose base they'd place offerings that would include complete arrows and the occasional bone. The style of dwelling they made in the caves was also recorded by Spaniards and is eerily similar to those in Cueva del Maguey. One account wrote about how the Xiximes and Acachis in the Sierra constructed houses on the sides of cliffs which would have rounded doors of vara, or 1.8 meters in length. It is speculated that due to the intergroup conflict that occurred between the Xiximes and other tribes, they chose locations that could be easily defended and where they could see everything from above in case any enemy approached, as was seen in the location of Cueva del Maguey. These cliff dwellings were also recorded in 1604 as housing family units. Quote, "They weren't very close, but each was with their children, grandchildren, and relatives in small settlements built on some hills or peaks that were difficult to climb, and the reason was the continuous wars among themselves, even though they were of the same nation and language." Unquote. Similar structures have been found throughout the area, the earliest Cueva del Olote, dating back to the 1030s AD. The site of Cueva del Maguey is a very important site with an incredible amount of preservation that is little known. Thankfully, however, this led to little to no looting, and many artifacts were still in situ that could help understand the ancient and even historic peoples of the Sierras of Durango, especially the Xiximes, who were associated with the site and who before the discovery of the cave were little known, and due to the scant mentions in Spanish accounts, were nothing more than savage cannibals. These discoveries helped to show that the Xiximes had a rich material culture that consisted of a cosmology that focused on uniformity and making war to help continue the cycles of growing and harvest of crops. Research like this is beneficial in helping to better understand the indigenous peoples of Aridoamerica and how they had a complex culture, especially those of the highlands of Durango.